There we are. Okay, so we are back. Dr. Kevin Kim has done a little refresh here. We're going to try and get him back on here. So everyone give a second warm welcome to Dr. Kevin Kim.
Hello, sorry about the interruptions. Let's continue with our presentation here. So we were talking about the single-arm trial. So all patients receive the same treatment, and there's no comparison. And frequently, it's used in phase 1 or phase 2 clinical trials before large randomized trial can be considered. And unfortunately, it doesn't definitely show that new treatment or study drug is definitely better than current standard or placebo in most cases, because the patient population can be skewed in this small single-arm trial. So trials may be better, it's more objective. So patients are randomly assigned to one of two, or even more treatment groups. And randomization is done randomly, as you can say, by computers, and should be balanced in regard to patient characteristics. So one group of treatment arm doesn't have better prognosis than the other arms. It has to be equal chance of prognosis. In this way, it minimizes a bias to one or the other treatment groups. And the comparison drug may or may not be placebo. In most cases, if patient has some standard treatment, and the standard treatment, current treatment, should be the comparison arm to the clinical study. However, in certain cases, that there's no great treatment arms, there's no effective treatment. In those patients, in these cases, placebo can be used as a comparison arms. And in the United States, the placebo arm for metastatic disease tend to be not very many. In European countries or other countries, tend to have a little more placebo arms. So basically, concept is patients enrolled. If 600 patients enrolled, maybe half of the patient will get drug A, the new drug, versus the other half will get standard treatment. And in another case, it could be 3-arm studies. So 1,000 patients enrolled, 1/3 or half of the patients will get drug A, and the other quarter of patients will get drug B or standard treatment. If the investigator believe drug A may be better than the other two drugs. Blinded versus open-label trials. Open label means doctors and patients know which drug the patient is receiving. Single-blind trial is a patient do not know which drug they are receiving, but doctors will know. Double-blinded means doctors and patients do not know which drug patient is receiving. So this is the most objective way. And in the institutions, maybe pharmacists who prepare may be the only person who knows which patient gets which treatment. So obviously, double-blind design trial is most objective, and it gets rid of the most bias. But sometimes this is not feasible. For example, if the trial that involves significant amount of the patient's intense treatment or possible complications, if the treatment requires the cannulations or introduction of the catheters throughout the body to isolate liver or heart, for example, to infuse study drug, then in those cases, you don't want to go through all these procedures for the placebo. So sometimes it's hard to know, it's hard to do double-blind studies, and but if it's doable, if it's feasible, then double-blind study can be encouraged. If overall survival is the main objective of trial, then this double-blind design matters less, because Well, when patients, how long they survive or they die, there's not the bias of which treatment patient receive. So if the endpoint is how long we can control disease, then double-blind design can be the most desirable the design of study. Prospective versus retrospective. Prospective means the study is designed before any patients are enrolled and receive treatment. And the progress of patients are monitored throughout the course of the treatment. Whereas retrospective design, this is the case. It's already patient received some treatments, maybe some standard treatment in the past, or some other treatments, and the case reports and case records can be analyzed statistically afterwards, after patient received. And investigators rely on methods employed and data available for the analysis. And this is the situation that when you see certain patient group have new, let's say, new mutation found in patients, and then the patient do with certain chemotherapy or immune therapy, we can go back to see 50 patients a series, 100 patients series to see how people do if they had mutations, because you already have data of those patients. So it'll be quicker to get the result. But then retrospective may not be the most objective because, well, some of the patient may have received treatments not according to the standard care, or patient might have received less frequent CT scans, so it's less objective than prospective trials. Pilot study means this is a small study that helps develop bigger study. So basically, this study will find out feasibility and possible difficulties of trial before larger studies can be designed. In general, there are 4 phases of drug development. Phase 1, phase 2, and phase 3, and phase 4. Phase 1 study is a small study, usually about 15 to 40 patients, although certain phase 1 trials can be much larger number of patients involved. The purpose of this trial is finding the right dosing schedule and looking at the safety of these new drugs. So it could be a first-in-human trial, that is brand new treatment. We have no idea how this works, but looks promising in animal studies. In that case, we have to find what's the right dose. Does it give it by IV? Does it give every day, every week, or by pills twice a day, once a day? And what dose? That's what phase 1 trial is. If the phase 1 trial establishes which dose is safe and which schedule is the right schedule, it goes to phase 2 studies, to the larger studies, based on dosing schedule found in phase 1 study. Now, patient get the same treatment, same dose, and look for efficacy of this treatment. Of course, we're looking at the safety as the collateral, the secondary objective, but main purpose of phase 2 is how effective is it. Tend to be larger study, usually 40 to 100 patient studies. Once phase 2 study shows promising, this new drug have good response, patients have good to control disease for a long time, looks promising to go phase 3 studies, then it'll be mostly randomized clinical study will happen in phase 3 studies. It's a larger studies. It could be hundreds and patients can be involved in the phase 3 studies. Basically, the purpose is try to compare this new drug with a standard treatment, current standard, to see if this new drugs are better than current standards. Or if there's no current standard, it could be against placebo as well. Phase 4 trial, more aftermarket. Once drug is approved by FDA, then we like to see post-marketing and looking at long-term safety and efficacy in this patient. So it's more or less rigorous. It's after the drug is marketed. Phase 1 studies, once again, is the FDA evaluation and determine the optimal dosing with the drug dose and schedules. Enrolls about 15 to 40 patients in general, although some phase 1 can be hundreds of patients. Usually single arm and open label study. and typically have frequent calls among investigators to share their experience and safety updates among investigators with a sponsor. Usually have extensive pharmacokinetic analysis, which means getting extra blood testing to see how long the drugs last in your body and the drug concentration in your body, and what happens after 1 day, after 2 days, after 1 week. Also pharmacodynamic analysis, which means what biological effect happens within the tumor or your body. So it could be a biopsy throughout the studies, or even blood test to see what's happening in your tumor. Phase 2 studies, the main objective is efficacy evaluation. How long we can control disease, what's the response rate, what's chance tumor shrink significantly out of 100 people, for example. It could be a specific set of population in general. It could be melanoma patient trial, it could be lung cancer patient trials, or even nowadays, regardless of which trial the cancer you have, if you have certain mutations, for example, ANTRAC is one of the mutations or fusions. It can happen throughout these different solid tumors. You can have clinical trials. If you have ANTRAC mutations or fusions, regardless of which cancer type you have, you can be involved in the trial. Enrolls about 40 to 100 patients. It could be the single-arm study, or it could be a small randomized design study. This may also have pharmacokinetic studies and pharmacodynamic studies, just like phase 1 clinical studies. And if this is successful, if phase 2 study looks very promising, then you go to phase 3 studies. But even if phase 2 studies is negative, it didn't show as good effect as you want, sometimes you can find out among those 100 patients, maybe a small subset of patients may have great results. So they can lead to maybe new trials of this new subset of patients with the same treatment. Phase 3 studies is probably the most important and requires these studies before FDA approval of the drugs, and typically enrolls hundreds and thousands of patients in multiple institutions and sometimes multinational trials. Frequently randomized designs. It could be open label or blinded, depending on how feasible this blind study can be done. And the downside of phase 3 is its costs. It's very costly studies. And several years ago, there is a report of the average cost of phase 3 studies. It could be as less as $90 million. It could be as much as even billions, $90 million are the typical, but it could be $100 million can be the cost of the phase 3 studies. So it takes about 5 to 10 years usually to complete phase 1 to 3 studies before this drug can be applied as a new drug application to FDA. And during this application process, submission to FDA, FDA will review complete detailed information about the product, this drug, the structure of the drug, results of the trials, preclinical animal study data, safety and efficacy to make decisions. And once accepted by this authority, FDA, then this can allow drugs to be marketed as a new drug status. Overall cost of drugs from the very beginning, from the animal studies, compound discovery, through the phase 1 to 3 trials until the drug is marketed, the estimate of cost is about $43 million, up to $2.9 billion, depending on how the trial is being done. So it's quite expensive process. A challenge of the trial is the poor patient recruitment is the number one reason the trial fails, aside from drug being negative. Even many of the academic institutions or large research centers, only about 3 to 5% of newly diagnosed adult cancer patients participate in clinical trial. And the reasons for this relatively low number is many. It could be that a patient may not be interested in this new treatment, or it's the burdensome to patients. Patient may have to travel to the centers long distance or frequently, too frequent. There'll be interruptions in their life and they'd rather not go into clinical trials, and it could be other reasons as well. Phase 4 studies, once again, post-marketing surveillance. Once drug is approved by FDA, then you can still have these studies to find long-term effects, or rare side effects can be studied. So are clinical trials safe? How about the patient's right protection? So how patients' rights protected with multiple mechanisms. So ethical and legal code that governs medical practice also applies to clinical trials. Approval of protocol by ethical committee is required. So informed consent, so patients know what are involved in this clinical trial before they sign up for the clinical trials. And there's a number of review boards from the institutions or the federal level. So in the institution or research center, scientific review can be done by the expert teams to see if the trial is sound, scientifically based is sound, or the risk of the patient. There's an ethical committee called the IRB, Institutional Review Board, that review the protocol to see if this is safe for the patients. This is the worst the trial for the patients or not. Throughout the trials, there are safety and monitoring boards meet regularly to discuss about any new concerns about side effects of this treatment to make sure that it does any toxic treatment doesn't allow it to be prolonged, and also effectiveness can be checked regularly. Ultimately, FDA is the one that oversees all the protocols to make sure these are the ethical trials. So why is human research highly regulated? The reason is that in the past, bad experience with the clinical trials. So past transgressions led to needs for laws and policies and codes to protect the rights and welfare of the human subject. Nuremberg doctor trial in 1946 is a good example. So as you know, during the Nazi Germany, there's some inhumane and brutal the experiment was occurred in humans, in prisoners and camp. So after World War II, when some of tried in the international court, they have to have some kind of standard to judge them against. So there is the Nuremberg Code was created at the time that shows basically that research had to be voluntary, that the great good of the trial, it definitely outweighs the benefit. In fact, there should be no harm to the individual in the clinical trials, and the individual can always quit whenever they want. So these are the common things Nuremberg Code made. In fact, the Nuremberg Code was not totally new concept at the time. Even in 1930s in Germany, they had this similar code for the ethical, conduct of trial. But unfortunately, when Nazi took over, they ignored, they kind of disband this code. That's why this the ethical code was ignored during the Nazi Germany. Also, the thalidomide tragedy. You probably some of you already know that in the European countries and Canada, thalidomide was marketed as the sedatives or anti-anxiety drugs or the nausea medication, morning sickness medication. So many men and women took this medication. And among them, the pregnant ladies, they received these medications, and later down the line, they found the birth defect can be found when the patient takes thalidomide during pregnancy. So over time, that led to the Kefauver-Harris the amendment, which requires that any new treatment should be tested for efficacy and safety, and the safety and toxicity has to be listed and will be well known before it can be marketed. Tuskegee experiment. This is the experiment that African American population men in Alabama recruited for the syphilis trial. Main purpose of this treatment trial was the natural course of disease of syphilis. What happens to the human body? What happens to the outcome? How they become better or not, or die of disease? The ethical problem came on when the cure for syphilis, the penicillin, was available in 1940s. The individual in the study was not told about the treatment for syphilis with penicillin, and some of the patients didn't know why they're in this clinical trials. From this bad experience, the Belmont Report was created. Basically, it shows three principles. One is the respect for the individuals, persons, and beneficence of the treatment, the justice for the patient. So especially the racially, ethnically has to be fair, not just skewed to one group. And human radiation experiments. This is the one during the Cold War, people concerned about the nuclear war. What's going to happen to human body when they're exposed to nuclear war? And people were recruited for the experiment, and they were given radiation. So they drink some solution to the radiations to see how long radiation stays in your body and how it's excreted. So they study the effect of the radiation. But many people were not told of the concerns for radiation or side effects of the radiation, or some of the patients didn't even know they are getting the radiation from this experiment. So there was kind of bad experience that caused the need for the laws and policies to protect the rights and welfare of the patients. So in the United States, evolution of regulations happened. In 1938, Food and Drug and Cosmetic Act was created, which allows the FDA to oversee safety of the drugs available at the time, and also required animal studies before it can be marketed. 1962, Kefauver-Harris Amendment is mostly based on thalidomide experience from Europe. It was created, so it requires the drug applicants to prove efficacy and also disclose all side effects of the medication before it can be approved by FDA. 1968, drug efficacy study implementation occurred. It reclassified drugs already on market at the time. There were thousands of drugs at the time they have to go through to classify which drugs are effective, which drugs are ineffective, which drugs are needed for the studies. So they kind of categorize this currently available drugs at the time. 1981, IRB review was required. IRB, once again, is the institutional review board. Ethical review of the research protocols and materials associated with the clinical trial had to be reviewed. 1997, the International Committee of Harmonization, the rules, and good clinical practice was implemented. It develops technical guidelines and requirements of the pharmaceutical product registrations throughout the international court. An international quality standard was created. So whatever happens, occurs in Europe, clinical trials, Canada, Japan, China, United States, we understand there was a similar way of conducting clinical trials and ethically. 1998, pediatric rules occurred that requires to include pediatric assessment of drugs if the drug will be used in a substantial portion of the pediatric population. And also international regulation, as we discussed, International Conference on Harmonization and good clinical practice was implemented. It's an international ethical and scientific quality standard for designing, conducting, recording, and reporting clinical trial results. Informed consent is very important in participating in a clinical trial. This is a process by which a subject voluntarily confirms his or her willingness to participate in a particular trial after having been informed of all aspects of the trial that are relevant to the patient's decision to participate. So patient will be given informed consent forms before patient can sign on to the clinical trials. It lists title of the trial, who's the sponsor of the trial, who's the PI, principal investigator of trial, purpose of the trial, why are we doing this trial, how many people will be participating in this clinical trial, and what exactly is involved in the study. So what process, what's the schedule of treatment, what other procedures need to be done, how long will I be in the clinical study, what are the risks of being in the study, what's the potential side effects, what's the complication risk of receiving this new drug or medical device. How about what's the benefit for me to taking into part in the clinical study? What other options are there? Confidentiality, especially it's important nowadays with all these privacy issues, and how do we secure the confidential information about me, my records. How about the cost? Who pays for what? Who pays for drugs? How much do I have to pay for this clinical trial? How about the research-related injuries? If something happens to a patient, happens to me by participating in the clinical trials, if I have complications, need to be hospitalized, then what's going to happen? Who pays for the cost of the complications? And who do I call if I have any questions during clinical trials? So problem areas of trials is the compensation in drug-related injuries. If it's mild, then it's less of a problem. But if you have a severe complications, then who's going to pay for it? Many times, it's based on the contract between the sponsor and the cancer center to negotiate who's going to pay for what in case of the injury. So that contract will specify, and the informed consent will probably show you about who pays what. Patient's rights. How about the confidentiality of data? I don't want my information to leak out to the newspaper. So how do you, confidentially keep my information private? And my right to withdraw. If I don't like it, for whatever reason, for side effects or too much of travel to the centers, if I want to withdraw, then I should be able to withdraw at will. Collection procedures and amount of biological material taken. So if you need extra blood tests or biopsies or some other procedure we have to done, then we have to see, patient has to know what's involved and whether it's not too much for patients to handle. Compensation and insurance claims should be specified before you sign up for clinical trials. And also selection of patients. Make sure that it's equally, regardless of sex, regardless of age, or the ethnic groups, it should be fair. How about potential downsides for me? So if I sign up, what can go wrong for me? It could be unexpected or severe side effect of a new compound. Even though we can sometimes tell what's expected of this drug, sometimes you can see some rare side effects or unexpected severe side effects can happen. So that's something that you may want to consider. Study drug can maybe not be effective. Even after all the promising results of the animal studies, the drug may not be effective. Strict testing procedures, clinical visits, and treatment schedule can be too much. Maybe I have to be in centers every week. I have to spend whole day, in the study centers, or I have to drive 5 hours to trial centers. So it could be major quality of life for me, not able to work, or interruption in my life. Also, breach of privacy, as we talked about, there could be potential side effect. Although the safeguard has been implemented in most clinical trials, make sure that you don't leak information accidentally or on purpose. So why should I participate in the clinical trials? Well, this is the way to try new promising drugs for me if I want to treat my disease. If the current treatment options is not great, it's not optimal, then of course, it's try the new promising drugs. Contributing to cancer research and science and potentially helping other patients. It could be some of the patients' motivation. Maybe, hopefully I can benefit from this treatment, but at the same time, I want to make sure that we contribute to science. Maybe the future generation may learn from my experience with me. And typically, study drugs are free. And more rigorous monitoring happens for the safety and cancer progress. So it could be more rigorous. So they'll, look close to my side effects while on the clinical trials. And my rights are protected through multiple mechanisms, such as IRBs and FDA oversight. But before taking part in clinical trials, read carefully the informed consent forms and take your time and ask questions to the investigator or your physician's research team so that you have complete understanding of this trial is about. Make sure you understand about other treatment options. There could be some good treatment options that you're not aware of. So you make sure you ask about other treatment options. Consider factors before participating: potential clinical benefit, side effects, expected side effects, cost to you, frequency of travel to the study centers, and so on. So how do I explore clinical trial options for me? Well, first, ask your doctor, oncologist, ophthalmologist, surgeons about available trials. They may know about some promising trials for you. Also, you can explore patient support advocacy foundational groups, such as Cure Insight, Melanoma Research Foundations, Cure for Melanoma, and such groups. They may have support groups to guide you, help you find clinical trials. And if you want to try to look at clinical trial yourself, then these are some of the sites you want to consider. So clinicaltrial.gov, this is the government federal level. All registered clinical trials will be listed in the clinicaltrials.gov site. Also, in fact, not just in the United States, trials happening in Europe and other countries will be listed in this government site. You can type in uveal melanoma, ocular melanoma, phase 3 studies, phase 2 studies in the United States, for example. So you can type those words. You can find certain trials available in the United States or whatever you would prefer. And the site you see on this level shows that what's involved in uveal melanoma trials. If you click on this site, you'll probably see what's right trials for uveal melanoma patients. Cancer.gov also has the treatment clinical trial search function. So you can use this website to look into clinical trials for you. Also, more about clinical trials in general that I talked about, and some other more details can be found in this website. Well, thank you for your attention. And more detailed clinical trial information about uveal melanoma, ocular melanoma will be discussed tomorrow morning by Dr. Omid Hamid and also Dr. Rich Carvajal and Dr. Sabna Patel. So more details, you can probably stay tuned for that. And at this time, I'd like to take your questions.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kevin Kim. It's a fabulous presentation. We do have a couple of questions, so I'm going to go into that here. Okay, so our question we have here is from Val. And as a clinical trial patient, does one have to sign away all rights, like before surgery, for the length of the trial?
So before surgery talk, I'm sorry, would you repeat the question one more time?
As a clinical trial patient, does one have to sign away all rights, like before a surgery, for the length of the trial?
Oh, not necessarily. So first of all, clinical trial is a voluntary. So if the trial involves surgery as a part of the clinical trial, then you have to go through the surgery to get the maximum benefit of this new approach. But if patient needs surgery aside from the clinical trials, then you can always tell the research team about your surgery options. Sometimes you can allow to have surgery, or not surgery if you decide not to. it can be still done even through clinical trials. If the surgical options is conflicting with these clinical trials, then you have to decide, the doctor will decide with you what may be the best option for you, what's the most benefit, going through surgery and clinical trials, or choose one or the other. So clinical trials are flexible. I don't think you are giving away all the rights. We can, even along the way, we can always make decisions and changes.
Perfect. And I know you had a lot of resources in your presentation, links and things of that nature. Will you have your presentation available for those to see that are attending the conference that we can add to your profile in Socio? Is it something that we would be able to do?
I'll be happy to. I'm not very the SNS, the savvy, so I'll be happy to share through maybe with you or through the Curing site, the website.
We'll take care of it for you. We'll make sure we get it on there. I'd love to take any other questions if people have them. Are there any other notes that you would like to? I know that trials are something that can make people really nervous. Do you have a suggestion of like a checklist of things that, maybe something that someone should consider before agreeing to do a clinical trial?
I think most important is take your time. That's the most important. And when you talk to the research team, you'll be overwhelmed. They talk about what's involved. Many times you are maybe fresh, newly diagnosed cancer patients, and you're already anxious. And then you talk about all the treatment options, clinical trial details, side effects can be overwhelming. So first time when you're here, don't expect to learn everything about the trials. Take copy of informed consent with you, go home and read in time, and talk to your friend, talk to your family, talk to other doctors about that. And then sometimes you have a better sense of what's going on.
That's really nice.
Also, write down some questions. If I didn't catch during the discussion with the study team, write down questions and ask again, call or meet in person to ask again about your questions so you're happy with your questions.
That's great advice. Yeah, and I think that's really great advice. And I think that I do have another question that's here, but I want to ask you, since we're on the topic of, making sure you talk with family and friends, with COVID being in place, and usually, when you go into a medical facility, you're only allowed to have yourself come to an appointment. And I know for some people, for larger surgeries or decisions, people like to take someone else with them to make sure that someone else is really understanding, because when you get your diagnosis or you're hearing about these things, sometimes you kind of glaze over and tone out. So do you have a suggestion for if you can't bring a loved one, can someone record that conversation? Is there a policy in place for something like that?
Yes, I think most people I know, most centers I know, they're allowed to have you can talk on the phones while the patient's here, wife, husband, families at home. Then we can do the three-way phone calls. So we can have speaker phones so they can ask questions from home, even if they're not with me. And it could be video conference with the patients, or they can, I allow my patients to record what I tell patients. So they go home and listen again with their family. So this can be all done. Certainly, COVID-19 era, it's quite difficult challenges now for many aspects, but it doesn't mean clinical trial stops. So if you need good treatment, we have to continue on. There's a way to overcome this COVID-19 restriction.
Okay, very good. So I've got 4 minutes left. We've got 2 questions, so that should be just enough time here. And I apologize if I'm looking to the right. That's where my second monitor is. So are there any trials for class 2 PRAME to uveal OM?
Yeah, so more details will be in tomorrow. Okay. So there's a number of trials, and if there's two, basically I can tell you there's 2 types of trials. One is a treatment trial for the metastatic unresectable disease. There's other adjuvant trials, meaning that after surgery is done or proton beam therapy, there's no active disease, and trying to prevent recurrence for 2 different purposes. So many of the trials, class 2 or not, if you have metastatic disease to the liver or other place, then you probably find clinical trials for PRAME positive trials or other trials. But if you have class 2 uveal melanoma at this time and trying to prevent recurrence, then there's not many, unfortunately, adjuvant trials for that group itself that I know of. So let's see what Dr. Hamid, Dr. Patel, and Dr. Baha can tell you more about.
That's super exciting. I mean, I think it's really exciting that we're we're in this conference and we get to hear the new things that are happening as they happen. So I think that's incredible. And we have one last question here from Suzanne. Can you briefly touch on an adjuvant, am I saying that correctly? Adjuvant trials, or are they not clinical trials?
Adjuvant trials are clinical trials. So adjuvant means usually after surgery or after radiation therapy. So the current active disease is treated at this point. There's no active disease at this point. And how do we prevent recurrence or reduce the risk of recurrence? That's what adjuvant therapy does. It means. So certainly for this kind of cases, that we can consider treatments to prevent recurrence. At this point, for uveal melanoma, there's no standard treatment for the adjuvant setting. So once it's done, proton beam is done, then we just observe closely and monitor closely. But then there's a trial at the multiple centers using immune therapy adjuvant trials. So this is one of part of the clinical trials. You have to sign up for it, and you have to know all the rights for participating in the clinical trials.
Thank you so much. So we're getting to the end of our segment here. We've got about a minute and 30 seconds. And I just want to mention that Kat has put navigatingclinicaltrials.gov can be confusing. The MRF has some more user-friendly clinical trial finders for melanoma patients here, and she's dropped a link. So please feel free to reference that. And then Sue Stewart says that she feels that her involvement in clinical trials, both for herself and her son, who has a genetic metabolic disorder, have helped future generations. It has been rewarding, and she feels that it's going to be part of their legacy. So I think that what you are doing, and it's really revolutionary. And so we're really happy and grateful that you were able to take some time today to talk with everyone who is attending the conference.
Thank you.
Absolutely.
Right.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kim. Well, I'm going to bring him off here, and we're going to go into a short 10-minute break. What we're going to do is we're going to have we're going to take 10 minutes, and you'll learn more information in just a moment.